very changed the architecture, the buildings, the impact of the technology, of the modernity, but he did not find some seduced by the socialist realism. He stubbornly restricted himself to take only picture of old Orthodox churches, so much that actually looking at them, one can be mistaken about the century. And Boris Groys writes, Kojève photography celebrates the dissolution of the subject into the neutrality, the anonymous, and into the objectivity of the lens eye. And Boris Groys is suggesting that truly these photos try to capture the essence of the post-historic condition. Like if, he keeps saying, Kojève photographic work is the continuation of his philosophy with other means, end of quote. Unlike Françoise, who was trying with this photo to embody a name throughout a face, a pose, a detail in the clothing style, he tried to make evident that meaning connected to a life. And this is, to me, the most philosophical feature of François' photography. He himself wrote, I soon realized an idea that became a certain to me. The act of photography is a female act. As the camera, I've been storing the person and his or her light. This is exactly the opposite of a gunshot. To make a portrait is always a strong, disturbing act that will go all the way throughout. But in order to make it reveal itself, it's necessary to step back. My Calvinist education, wrote François Lagarde, helped me a lot in this respect. I loved the photography, especially for the desacralized space with no room for the only one. This mechanical presence has an enormous impact in the relationship with the others. End of quotation. And he keeps writing in another write. There is something in the photography that really upset me and has always struck me. I have always loved the clean image. I love the depiction when its clarity saves it from any possible ambiguity. I love when you don't see anything else than the thing you see. I can bear the depiction that let you guess multiple directions. I think we should start from this clarity, get out from the self-depiction, get out of the failed speech of a freedom of choice into the falseness, and be more attentive to the point of view offered by the other. So I guess that François' work was exactly to question that the subject, to try to set a relationship with the other. The issue of the portrait is clearly more blurred and subtle than we can think and forces both the photographer and the viewer of the photograph to a philosophical relationship with the image. By the way, Deleuze's idea of visage-paysage return in François' work. So as in the etymological root of the word portrait, the same of the Italian word ritratto, from Latin re, that is to say back, and traere, that is to say to pull back. Here it's clear that the portrait imposes a reflection that goes beyond the notion of aesthetic as a perceptive feeling and of reproduction representation. This is what François Lagarde early called the female act. The photographer must put himself in the attitude of an expressive perception, characterized by an action of acceptance of not of censure. This is the philosophical aspect of his work, connected with the idea of the individual as a fluctuating and varying identity that change in accordance with the becoming. Thus, the individual from begin an exact subject is more like a process that cannot be fixed, defined, ever. To conclude, I like to think that this film is the portrait that François wanted to make of Kojève, uncompleted, unfixed, always in becoming, and certainly one of the most vivid portraits of the philosopher we have. Thank you very much. And sorry for my English.
Not at all. Thank you, Marco. Thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting. And I think there'll be lots of points to keep from that and bring up in the discussion. So our second speaker is Nina Kousnetzoff, who had a career as an economist, but she also has a very special perspective on Kojève, having known him as the niece of Nina Ivanov, his partner. She was involved in the donation of his manuscripts, photos, and other materials to the BNF. So, you know, very involved in the significant archival work that has been going on and is continuing to go on with Kojève. Je pense que c'est en français que vous allez intervenir, Nina.
No, finally, I decided to speak English because I think it's easier, as many people would be in difficulty for French, I suppose.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, so first, I wish to thank the organizers for this very interesting conference. And thank you, John, for presiding this session. So I will just say a few comments on the film by François Lagarde and Christine Baudillon. First, the merits of the film. The film brings together a lot of documents on Kojève. First, the sound documents, in particular, those who were already gathered by Jean Dève for his program in 1990 on France Culture, which was called Une vie, une œuvre. Secondly, photographs, of course, also representing Kojève and photographs made by Kojève. In particular, the black and white photos, which were made, I want to mention, on glass plates, and as well as the color slides, were all excellently restored for the film, which was the first time they were restored. The film also shows diagrams contained in the manuscripts, which were also restored in very high definition. Okay, and finally, the film reconstructs the life and migration routes of Kojève, as you have seen, using documents from the same periods. Okay, now, secondly, the film deals with both aspects of Kojève's intellectual life as a philosopher and as a civil servant in the French administration. On his activity as a civil servant, that is to say, as an international negotiator, the film is very lively and well documented, I found. In particular, thanks to the witness by Raymond van Vanfie. Now, regarding his philosophical activity, there are unfortunately no testimonies in the film from people who knew Kojève. Marco Filoni speaks, of course, masterfully about Kojève's philosophy in the film and about the influence of Kojève on his time. And we must mention that it was also Marco, in his role as a journalist, who interviewed people really say what they said. Also, Bernard Esbois, for his part, testifies, in my sense, very well to the effect produced on a philosopher by the reading of Kojève. my general impression is that the part on Kojève's philosophical activity is more addressed to people who have already read his work in this film, but maybe it's a personal impression. Now, to conclude, I would like to say a few words about my personal impressions while watching the film. The introductory scene on Kojève's death, which are one of the very few directed by François Lagarde himself, this scene is truly impressive. Now, in my opinion, the sound part of the film, which begins just after this introductory sequence, I mean the music and the voiceover, in my opinion, gives a melancholy character to the way in which Kojève's life is told. His life was dramatic, but he was, of course, not a sad character. In fact, this irony is often mentioned in the film. To make it bigger, I would say that at the beginning of the sequence showing Kojève's parents and his childhood, I had the impression of a funeral march with a funeral oration. In the same way, the choice of the piece of gypsy music to accompany the last image of Kojève against the backdrop of the mountains in Turkey, this piece doesn't correspond to his personal tastes. Yes, as I said in the film, he appreciated very much Russian gypsy music, but he rather appreciated pieces like the one that follows and that accompanies in the film the end credits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. Yes, thank you. And I'm trying to think of a film featuring all of the people who knew him as a philosopher, Lacan next to Bataille, next to Queneau, and so on. But that would have had to be shot in the 50s, I suppose. It wasn't. So I'm sure people will have questions for Nina about what she said and about other aspects of Kojève's life. I'm thinking. Okay, I'm going to go next. So I'm going to use my my position here. I'm going to talk for hopefully 10 minutes or even less. And then we're going to come on to Todd McGowan. And I'm going to try to say 4 things in that time. The first is about François Lagarde. Marco's already spoken about him, and I had the chance to meet him and yeah, precisely to have this very warm character come into my life. I became aware of him through his films on Philippe Lacour-Labarthe. Again, travel logs going around Switzerland and various places. Sounds fairly similar to what he did with Marco. I also became aware that François had frequented various kind of major figures, well-known figures of 20th century culture. Albert Hofmann, the inventor of LSD, William S. Burroughs, Ernst Jünger, the German World War I hero, but also later an experimenter with LSD and the subject of the film Le Rouge et le Gris, which is definitely to be recommended if you can manage to see it. As well as Allen Ginsberg, the American beat poet. So François had known or worked with or worked on all of these figures. And I think they are quite different to Kojève, but maybe there's something to be shared and that can explain the choice of making a film on Kojève. The second point I want to talk about is at a particular point in the film, you have this fictitious dialogue he writes between Descartes and Buddha when he's very young. And he phrases something about the Buddha statuette, which I found quite interesting. The link is from the previous thing is actually an Allen Ginsberg poem, when the narrator of the poem starts kind of imagining his death and bidding farewell to all the precious things in his life. And the unusual bit of this is that he bids farewell to all the religious beliefs about the afterlife that he's had. Okay, so rather than seeing that as the thing he's now going to come to, he's saying, I quote, "Goodbye heaven, farewell nirvana, paradise, adieu," and so on and so on. So the idea is that all of these ideas are the ideas that we have during our lives. They're human ideas, human creations, and then we actually leave them behind as we leave everything else behind. And this seemed to fit with this idea of the Buddha statuette, who Kojève describes as traveling around the world, almost as a sort of peripatetic student, or someone who travels a lot, as Kojève would himself. So that he's almost an active force in the world. He's not a representation of some other divinity in the afterlife, but is actually a real creation responding to human need or human desire. So obviously we know that we're working in an atheist kind of envelope here, but still there are some interesting ideas about theology and religion in Kojève, and particularly in this film. The third point was about the opening, where you have this, the bell ringing, the death knell, the glas, with a sort of bell in Brussels ringing, and the extraordinary recording of Kojève's death, you know, the moment. It's really an emotional, I think, moment to listen to that. And I'd heard about this recording, I can't remember if it was from François or from somewhere else, for years, but to finally have it in the film, I think is an important moment. So much to say about that philosophically. I've been reading Jeff Love's book, The Black Circle, okay, and I just found that was a very, almost an attack on Kojève, or at least, you know, suggesting that this freedom from the animal desire has to translate into willingness to die, you know, sort of live free or die attitude, and that, you know, whenever you speak about revolution, you also have to speak about terror, which Hegel would have seen at the time of the French Revolution, and Kojève himself, as we see, lived through and very nearly, you know, came a cropper in the Russian Revolution. So that sort of invoked or informed all of these discussions that I was hearing yesterday about the homogeneous end state. How ironic is Kojève being when he's talking about that? For someone who's come face to face with this terror, is he invoking this with irony? Is he ultimately speaking a little bit like John Maynard Keynes when he says, "In the long run, we're all dead"? But the important thing is in the long run, you know, that it's not something that he actually wants to consider, it's everything else that matters. And then the final thing is the photos. Yeah, so people have mentioned this already. François Lagarde works with photos. That's what he does in the Ernst Jünger film as well. He collected thousands of German photos of World War I, the trenches, and precisely he said that it's like a gunshot for those soldiers. So to hear that coming back in the opposite way with Marco is very interesting. It also particularly means that film is a particularly good medium for talking about Kojève. It's not just a film on Kojève but a film on Kojève because Kojève is a photographer, someone who's very interested in the image. As we know, Boris Groys has worked on this. In the BNF, you have this archive with, I think Groys said, 5,000 slides, 10,000 postcards. It's a huge kind of material, you know, weight there of these images. And often, as Marco was saying, in this touristic genre, with the photos being empty, you know, featuring architecture or squares and so on, but devoid of people, devoid of events and vitality. as if this homogeneous end state had already washed over humanity and washed away all the heterogeneity. That's a bit different though from some of the photos we see in the film, especially from the 1920s. And I thought that was a really strong part of the film, the sort of bohemian milieu that Kojève was frequenting in the 1920s, where human faces, precisely the human, is right there, it's right at the center of these photographs. So you know, he seems to have gone from one extreme to the other in his photography, but also they revealed that he went from one extreme to the other in terms of the negotiations that he was involved in. Now, negotiation is a negation of otium. Otium is leisure, désœuvrement in French. So the great negotiator of this latter life was actually someone who spent a lot of time hanging about, you know, not working, living a sort of glad bohemian life. So it seems to me very, very ironic to read all of these things about the master and the aristocratic way of life, someone who does not work, but only is prepared to risk his life completely. So yeah, so that's the last thing I would say, really, that it's versus someone like Maynard Keynes or versus even Bataille and others. He seems very ironic, Kojève. He seems to be sort of using all these discourses in a way that is very, very dry. So I'd be interested to know if that's been written on, if other people agree, or if they strongly disagree. There you go. All right, that's what I wanted to say. But I'm going to keep talking for one more minute with the aim of presenting our last speaker, who is Todd McGowan. Todd is professor at the University of Vermont and has an incredibly long list of publications, seems to publish a book a year going back a decade and more, so I won't even start to read out the titles, but his work figures or looks both at major theoretical figures, Hegel, Marx, Freud and so on, but also at media involving film, television and more. So hand over to you, Todd.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. And I know I was recruited to talk about film, but I'm going to talk about film. I'm going to get into the film by starting out just talking about Kojève's thought and how I see it, how I see the film trying to represent that thought. So, to me, I know that Kojève is primarily, and I think the film focuses on this, primarily this thinker of the end of history and mutual recognition. And I think it's fair to say that his main legacy philosophically was this idea of an ideal of mutual recognition. For instance, like Judith Butler, Robert Pippin, Robert Brandam's whole book on Hegel, even though it's explicitly written against Kojève, it kind of takes, interestingly, Kojève's point of departure as its own. So that's, I find that fascinating. But I say that as a way to move away from that, because I think that for me, what makes Hegel the great philosopher of the 20th century, which I mean, sorry, it's a funny slip. What makes Kojève the great philosopher of the 20th century is that he was the first, and I think maybe only, thinker able to marry dialectics and phenomenology. And what interests me is the way in which the film is trying to represent or formally indicate that marriage. And so I think the way that he does this is through, for Kojève, that is, his emphasis on temporality. I noticed that in the film, this is something that keeps coming up, this idea of our relationship to time, and which is related to our relation to death. And the fact that the film, as people have mentioned, this jarring beginning, which was, I found really disturbing in a good way, that we were confronted with the death of Kojève at the beginning of the film, and then we work backwards. And so what struck me about that is that that's the way in which, that seems to me, that notion that our being towards death, something that is totally foreign to Hegel's thought and comes from Heidegger, is brought into the film. And I guess for me, the way in which Kojève brings together, as I said, dialectics and phenomenology, or Hegel and Heidegger, which what's interesting to me is, I think most people today who, these are the people I know that are Hegelian and invested in Hegel's thought, see a real antithesis or antipathy to phenomenology in general and to Heidegger in specific. And so the idea that Kojève could find a way to bring those together in a coherent philosophical system, I think is really incredible and appealing. And so today, I think to be Hegelian means to recognize the way that a dialectical structure subtends all sense of temporality, so that the existence of temporality is necessarily misleading. So I have an experience of my own temporality. It gives me a false sense of the immediacy of my experience. And I think that's what the charge of Hegel against someone like Heidegger or Husserl would be. And that Heidegger thus misses the way in which there's a certain mediating structure that's already in place. And for Hegel, what he insists on is the awareness of this mediating structure, even though it undergoes a dialectical change over time. So I think by emphasizing Hegel's identification of the concept in time, Kojève, I think, is trying to close this separation between dialectics and phenomenology through temporality. And what he says is Hegel is the first thinker to identify the concept and time. So for Hegel, this doesn't mean that there's an originary temporality that occurs before all social mediation, which I think it does for Heidegger, but Kojève tries to interpret this Heideggerian thrownness into time alongside Hegel's identification of time with the concept. So how can those two things, which seem separate, be together? And I think Hegel does this in an interesting way. And I think that the film tries to get at this, that what Kojève does is eliminate dialectic from Hegel's system. So he even says, one could, this is from the introduction to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, one could say that in a certain sense, Hegel was the first thinker to have abandoned dialectic as a philosophical method. And so his point is that Hegel, I think that's only in the French, I'm translating it, I think it's only in the French version of the English, I was talking to someone right before that the English version is very circumscribed, that you miss a lot of the crucial points. So Hegel describes dialectical movement of history, but he's not caught up in that dialectical movement in the way that every other thinker has been. And so by analyzing the dialectical process, Hegel, Kojève thinks, removes himself from it. And in this way, he can become an ally of Heidegger, this phenomenologist attuned to the temporality of our being. Since his concern is with, I think Kojève's concern is with temporality, he has to reject Hegel's philosophy of nature as just nonsense. And I think this is why we get this concern with the human in his photographs and the human form in his photographs that are present in the film. So in his lectures on the phenomenology of spirit, Kojève identifies Hegel's method not with dialectic, but precisely with phenomenology. So I find this really fascinating. He says, in fact, the method of Hegel is nothing other than the method that today we call phenomenology. So I think this turn to Heidegger actually becomes clearest at the end of the lectures when he says that accepting without reserve of death or finitude of human consciousness is the source of all Hegelian thought. And I think it's an interesting thing, because I think for Hegel, we're fundamentally infinite beings, and for Heidegger, we're fundamentally finite beings. And so what Kojève is trying to do, I think, is finitize Hegelian thought, turn it into a thought of the finite. And I thought that the film was so, in my way, very impressively concerned with making Kojève into a figure of finitude. And that's why I think the beginning of the film is so crucial to everything that's going on, and the way, what John just mentioned, the way in which he narrowly escapes death with the 1917 revolution, that there's always this sense of Kojève's own finitude. And for him, the encounter with finitude is exactly equivalent to Hegel's absolute negativity. And I think that's something that when I first encountered Hegel and Heidegger together, I was drawn to, and I didn't see that there was an absolute divide between them. But I think that Kojève shows how we can maybe bridge that divide in a way that I think thinkers today don't. I think you're sort of either on the side of Heidegger or on the side of Hegel, and Kojève's great originality, it seems to me, is to bring them together. And I liked the way the film was trying to do that formally. That's all I have.
Fantastic, Todd. Thank you. Very rich and lots to say and lots to talk about there. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Let's start with those, shall we? And then please think of your questions and maybe either put your hands up or just leap in once we've done those. So these are from Hager for question to Marco. In your biography of Kojève, actually, can you see that, Marco? Can you see the first question? Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I worked a lot on the intellectual biography of Kojève, and for me was very important to sleep into to consider the thinking and the life. So, you know, in Kojève it's very difficult to separate the two, but in the same time we cannot presuppose that in every Kojève's act of his life there is a philosophical concept beyond. And at the same time, when Ager asked me if I changed my view, this morning I was talking with Massimo Palma, and he talked to me. He said, "So I'm not agree with you. What do you say in the film?" And I say, "You're right. Me too. Me neither. I'm not agree with myself." So, you know, 12 years ago, I have an idea of the end of history of Kojève, and after I study a lot of. So I think that in this moment, it's a very good moment to study Kojève. There is a lot of manuscript that we are discovering. Danilo is working a lot about this kind of administrative and political writing. And Massimo Palma also he wrote a very important book, for my opinion, about the mythology. I'm sorry that the book is only in Italian, about the mythology, how Kojève used Hegel, and if Kojève made a mythology, and this word, it's a very complicated word. Mythology, it's a use that Kojève made of Hegel. But maybe Massimo, I cannot to interpret you. Maybe you can explain better than me about your point of view about Kojève. So, and yes, I changed my view on Kojève a lot of time, and I think that at the end, the film that François made on Kojève, it's a kind of, I know, you know, it's a kind of biographical point of view. And when I'm so grateful to him, because I had the opportunity to speak with Bernard Esbois, Raymond Fanfanfi, and this is with the souvenir of Nina. And I think that the two of this part, it's very interesting for a viewer that doesn't know Kojève a lot.
Thanks, Marco. That's great. There's one more question from Hager, then we'll come to Igor and Danilo. So about the post-production, are there any scripts that François left? Well, there is a, I can tell you there's a literal script, a transcription of everything that's said, and Christine worked with him during the making, and now she's been the person responsible. So I suppose it's Christine's idea of what François wanted, and I know she was quite strict to keep to that. She didn't want to change it. She wanted to make his film, is how I understood that. But does anyone else have comments on post-production? No. Okay, if not, let's go to Igor, shall we, and then Danilo.
Yeah, sorry about that. This is a general question in light of kind of the concluding phases of the film and also reoccurring theme in the film. And I suppose I could try to direct it to Nina Kuznetsov. And it has to do with Kojève's relation to the Soviet Union. I like that the film left it as an open-ended question and doesn't impute, some kind of a KGB necessarily agent or something like that, which again is left as an open question. But what are your thoughts about Kojève's relationship to the Soviet Union? Not necessarily Stalin, right? But the reason I ask this question is because he seemed to think it had potential of some kind, and he also had an attachment to it, notwithstanding his departure, right, from the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution as a young man. So I guess the real question is what you think his relationship or outlook towards the Soviet Union was. It's kind of an open-ended question, and if there's anything to be learned from that relationship with respect to his works, like on the notion of authority, right, where he sometimes I wouldn't want to say conflicts, but groups certain leaders like Stalin, Franco, and others in the same category. But I'm more interested in the first question, namely, what do you think was his relationship or outlook towards the Soviet Union?
Yes, well, it's not a very simple question. What I can say is just what I remember from what he said, of course. And once I went with him to Moscow, by the way, in 1964. So I also saw how he looked at Soviet Union at that time. I would say that he had a double approach. Well, he considered in general that something extraordinary had been done, and that we could witness in USSR a society without social classes, okay, with equality. That's how he saw it in 1964. And that they had done a lot of construction of a country, etc., and a country, and not international place. But on the other side, he still had this approach to Russians in general, whom he recognized in USSR, that they were, how to say, not civilized. That the real civilization was West, was Japan, etc., but that the Russians were not civilized people. So in this way, they had many defects, in particular the disorder, which he himself, as someone mentioned, didn't like very much. So this is what I can testify.
Can I just ask, this is an open-ended question, because I've been interested in legal theory for some time. And when I compare his work, the outline, Phenomenology of Right, there are some parallels when it comes to exchange with the Soviet legal theorist Yevgeny Pashukanis. Is there a sense at all that he was familiar with Pashukanis, who also spent time in Germany, in Munich, where he had got his education? I'm just for my own, obscure curiosity. Okay, I'll take that as a no. That's all for me.
No, I have no idea. I never heard him mention this person anyway. Never heard mention.
Thank you very much.
Trevor, you had your hand up. Was it a question about Kojève Russianness? Because that might lead on.
No, I think I'm after Danilo. My question was in part answered, but I can wait.
Okay, let's go to Danilo then.
Yeah, thanks for the film, by which I was really pleasantly surprised, I have to say. I had been unaware of François Lagarde's work, and I now also want to see his documentary on Ernst Jünger. And just as an aside, I think one of the last extended interviews Ernst Jünger gave was with the Italian journalist Antonio Gnoli in the Franco Volpi, or Thinkers even. And I think they asked him whether he had met Kojève, and he says that it was one of the great regrets because Ernst Carl Schmitt had repeatedly talked about Kojève and he never got around to meeting him. So I think Jünger and Kojève is also one of the great rencontres manquées of this century. The second point I would like to make is just, I think it would be useful to locate the film in the general development of Kojève studies. Yeah, I think it marks a certain moment there, because I would situate the film in what I would call the archival turn in Kojève studies. I mean, obviously, Dominique Offray's biography remains a pioneering work, but there's a certain number of flights of fancy, mostly related to a sort of psychoanalytic reading of Kojève that I found problematic. And there's often in other texts a sort of tendency to take Kojève's thought-provoking ideas and to run with them. And it was really your work on Kojève, Marco, that sort of ushered in a new moment in the history of Kojève studies. For me, that was a complete game changer through its focus on unpublished text, through its rigorous chronology, through its careful contextualization. And I think the film really bears the imprint of that approach. And I think that makes it all the stronger. Even though I have to say, seeing you now makes me slightly melancholic, because not of a fashionable beard you've grown during the pandemic, but because your background obviously wants me to go on a holiday in Italy immediately. And one of the my final comment, what concerns Nina, is what she said about the sort of light-hearted and life-affirming side of Kojève. And there's obviously, I think, this quote reported by Raymond Aron, Kojève said, "La vie est une comédie, il faut la jouer sérieusement." And I think this sort of like utter earnestness and intellectual ambition combined with a sort of mischievous character really transpires in that quote. Still, I think I was somehow wondering, because the film opens with that sort of, with this death scene, how Kojève would have imagined his sort of life post-retirement, old age. And I don't know, Nina, whether you've seen that a couple of years ago, the correspondence was published between Hannah Arendt and Anne Weil. Anne Weil, obviously the wife of Eric Weil and a close friend of Kojève. And there's a letter 68 in which Anne Weil informs Hannah Arendt that Kojève had died, which is extremely sad news. But then she said, maybe it's not a bad thing he passed away so suddenly, because she said that Kojève had said to her that he was terrified of old age and terrified of the frailty and of the diminishing intellectual powers old age would entail. So I was wondering, did Kojève talk to you about sort of like being, I don't know, about what his life would look like after retirement? Because there seems to be really someone who's always been in possession of his physical intellectual powers. And I can imagine that, looking at the problems old age would bring wasn't very easy for him sometimes.
Yes, in fact, Kojève had formally retired because in French civil service, the retirement age is 65. So when he was 65, which was in 67, he had to retire officially. But he immediately arranged with his director to be on contract with a research center, which was in the public French administration, but independent. By the way, completely not knowing it at all at the time, I myself joined this economic institution much later, and I was told about it by the director of the institution when I joined. So Kojève joined this, what was called GEPI, G-E-P-I, but in fact, he continued to do exactly the same work as he did before. And the director of GEPI was disappointed because he was very pleased to have Kojève at the institute, and he met him once, And after that, Kojève never went again to the GP and continued to use his office on Quai Branly and to do exactly the same as before. So I think that, in fact, he didn't want to retire at all. And it is known that he was getting very sick at the time. And I'm sure that he continued to have a life exactly as he wished it, not sparing himself at all. On the contrary, I mean, on the work side and also on the private side, he didn't spare himself at all. And well, I think it's quite possible that he was conscious that he was shortening his life in this way, and he was not against it, I think. Yes, I just wanted to say three small things that somebody mentioned before. First, just to precise that in the film, contrary to what you can imagine, you don't really have a moment of Kojève's death, because I think that already Jean Dève did this juxtaposition between two moments. In fact, from witnesses that I met afterwards, Kojève died while the Dutch representative was answering to his own speech. So you hear his own speech in the film, and then the Dutch representative answered him, and this is while he died. And then someone cut it because it was out of interest. Also about this moment, I just wanted to say that his last words, in fact, I thought about it again after what some presenters said yesterday about Kojève and Europe and Kojève and Japan, of course. And you can hear that he's skeptical about the possibility of European Union to have a common policy. He says that still there is no common external economic policy, and he really doesn't know how it could happen. And then he says just one thing about Japan, which, by the way, I think there is a small mistake in the English version, because about Japan, it is translated that Japan will do no less and no more than the US in terms of commercial policy. But in fact, what Kojève says is that Japan will do not one drop more than Japan, and not, Japan will not do one drop more than the US, and will not do it 1 minute earlier than US. Okay, and now I also wanted to mention what François Lagarde told me about what determined him to choose Kojève as the subject of his film. In fact, François met with somebody called Gray. Unfortunately, I just cannot remember his first name, but I think that Marco knows it, and who was a Canadian civil servant who had more or less the same position as Kojève in Canada, and who told him a lot about Kojève's negotiating powers and how he proceeded. And by the way, Gray published an article in the archives of Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which is not very easy to find, but I think some of you have already found it, where he describes very precisely how Kojève used his dialectical skills to negotiate. And I think this is quite a compliment to what Raymond van Venfie says. Okay, yes, and just the last word. I think someone of you said that the English word of the film, if I understood well, was not like the French version, but in fact, it's very close. It's exactly the same. As I said, there are just very few kind of mistakes in the translation. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, it's mainly because you have to compress. You don't have as much space, so there's occasional paraphrases. But yeah, I take that point on that one example. There are questions from Massimo, Ari, and Isabel, but I just wonder if we could stay with what Danilo said about, is there an archival turn at the minute and we're maybe moving away from the psychoanalytical readings with psychoanalysis being a sort of conjecture, you know, in the lack of evidence? Is that something that is a widely shared view, or is anyone going to come in and defend psychoanalysis as a sort of, you know, valid? I think that would be, is there anyone who's going to come into the debate on that side? No. Todd, you've written about psychoanalysis. Do you think it's relevant to?
No, I'm really invested in psychoanalysis, but I think I'm totally against psychobiography, and I think that's what you're being critical of. So yeah, I have no quarrel with that. Yeah, I think psychobiography is kind of nonsensical. So yeah.
Okay, let's go with what Danilo is saying. Massimo, over to you.
Trevor was before me, I think.
Oh, was
No, it's okay. My question was answered. Massimo, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, it's not actually a question. It was just something, kind of a comment about the importance of having seen this film in this workshop. Since I mean, it's Kojève is a character, you know, and he has always been interpreted like that, aside from being a philosopher and a thinker. And the two sides coexist actually, which is the pity of his interpretations later, but is also the fact that this character never ends to astonish people who meet him. And so it's, I mean, for the new generation of scholars confronting Kojève, seeing this film is a kind of getting back to the first interpretations that have been given, Bernard and Marco when he was young, and you have archives, you have a lot of images of this character, which is not reducible to his thoughts, and this is the problem actually. This is a huge problem. When you meet Heidegger, you would like to forget his life and just concentrate on focus on his thoughts. When you meet Kojève, you have to think how it has been possible for him, for example, to be a high civil servant in France for 23 years. When Bernard says during his interview, he's someone who has lived avant 68, before 68. That's an important statement that needs to be thought once again. He is a 20th century man at his peak, and he's contradictory, he's ambiguous, he's provocative, and one thing that we don't find during this film is his correspondence, his letters, which are so an enigmatic side of him, which are just as private as most part of his thoughts until his death. But they are nowadays, 50 years after his death, they are so decisive for the interpretation. When you read his correspondence with Carl Schmitt, with Leo Strauss, some letters we have with Bataille, you understand much part of what Zohar calls the tragic side of Kojève and the comic side of Kojève, Bataille and Queneau together, and their links. So, I mean, it's important because yesterday we have had so many good presentations concerning the thoughts and things like concepts of law and of right in Kojève and the role of administration, what kind of public state, public right he was thinking of. But at the same time, we still have, and we will have until the end of interpretations of Kojève, we will still have the problem of this character, of his ambiguity. The film ends with the explanations of the suspicions everyone has. He was a spy and so on. Just like, I mean, to make an important reference, just like Machiavelli, Kojève was a man of action, has been a man of action at the same time. But doing this, he did it with an extreme irony. And I mean, can we do without, can we study Kojève without thinking about his character, his playing with words, and his intention, you know, just like the infamous letter to Tran Duc Thao in 1948, to do propaganda, you know, to propagate what ideals. There's an important quote in the film about, you know, we hear Kojève saying that the importance that the word that logic is used to be efficacious, to be effective, and to provoke effects on the public, and that the important thing is not the truth, but what you do with words in front of the public. I think we cannot do without this enormous ambiguity and in Kojève's public and private image, which now are getting together, but weren't so easily to understand 40 years ago, or even when Kojève was alive. Only a few people knew about this duplicity or these many sides together. So the point is, biography in Kojève is strictly important, and archives have to open up even more and to give us more about this, to solve problems that are still unsolved. So,
thank you, Massimo. Thank you. And yes, I think that's what this conference sets out to do, isn't it? So let's go to Isabel, one of the organizers who wanted to come on.
Yes, thanks, John. I think it goes in quite a similar direction to what Massimo was just speaking about. I just wanted to express to Nina Kuznetsov and to Marco as well, and the filmmaker, and how valuable for a young researcher of Kojève it is to see this material and to actually have this quite intimate and private approach to Kojève's life and the people surrounding him, and how this is related to his philosophy. And I think it's a very rare document that we have this film now. And my question to Nina Kuznetsov, which could be similarly posed to Marco as well, because you were doing so much work over such a long time on Kojève. But my question to Nina would be, as John also mentioned in the beginning, that you worked as an economist, and I would be interested in how Kojève's vision and your personal contact to him and his vision and his way of being also influenced your work or your career and your economic outlook?
Well, in fact, I didn't intend to be an economist when Kojève was alive. And about his influence on my work, etc., he was extremely directorial. I mean, he spoke about freedom, but he wanted people not to go wrong. So he had a kind of tyrannic objective for me, but I was okay, so I didn't, which was that nowadays the best career was to become a civil servant. Well, in fact, I agreed with him. Of course, it was very difficult not to agree with him. I mean, he was extremely powerful in his arguments. So I went to the Institut d'études politiques in Paris, which I finished, in fact, in 1968. And after his death, well, I mean, already 1 year before, I had decided that it was not my real choice. So after that, I spent 4 years doing pure mathematics, which was maybe also after Kojève's death, which was maybe also his influence after death, as I knew that he was interested in mathematics. And finally, I came back to this statistical and economic research, but it was also through Kojève's influence in some ways, because I met with Pierre Moussa, who was a friend, well, a colleague of Kojève and whom he knew very well, who recommended to me to enter the statistical school of the INSEE, which I did after my mathematics maîtrise. And finally, I choose, well, having then skills in statistics and economics and mathematics and political sciences, I finally chose to work in a research center which was specialized in international economics. And of course, this was post-influence of Kojève. And as I said earlier, I discovered that Kojève had been a contractuel, as we say in French, of this organism for some months between just before his death. So I think he had this influence on about civil service, public service, and also about international areas being the most interesting things to do.
Thank you,
If
Nina.
I can, may I have just 2 words?
Oh yeah, Marco, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. About what Nina was saying, I met in the past 20 years some people who met Kojève during his life. I met Pierre Vimont, the French ambassador and diplomatic, Yves Derricot, who doesn't met Kojève, but he was executive chief of the DRE, Direction des Relations Économiques Extérieures, and the same institution where Kojève worked. And I met Raymond Barre. I met Raymond Fanfanfi, and it's like Nina is saying about it's very, very powerful, and it was very I don't know how to say in English. It's Yves Derico. He said to me, I've never met Kojève because when I started to the DRE, he's died. But in the 40 years that I worked in the DRE, all the people who met Kojève speak about him like a genius, like someone who changed your life, with this, not only with the good practice, with the like Nina say, it's a sort of tyrannic, and when he doesn't agree with you, I think he used to be very, very how to say, direct. But at the same time, when Raymond Barre talked to me about Kojève, his face change. It's like he said to me, it's one of the most important meeting that I have. So it's this is about the personality of Kojève. So thank you.
Let's go to Kyle, shall we?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, if I could, I wanted to ask maybe a slightly more philosophical question. I thought I might be able to direct it at Todd. And you'll have to excuse me for it'll be a little bit open-ended, but I wanted to comment about, I mean, it's difficult to have any sort of conversation or even begin to talk about Kojève without immediately falling into this trope of the end of history, and everybody always wants to bring this up. And in the film, we seem to have two different takes on the end of history. And I'll excuse Marco because, as he says, he changed his mind many times, and I have a great sympathy for that studying Kojève. And during my thesis that I've been working on Kojève, I've changed my mind many times as well. But in the film, he said that the end of history was the end of God. He equated it in this way at that time. You did, Marco. And at the same time, you said that, and I think I'm paraphrasing here, but you said something about it opening up to reality, to as it really is. So it's at the same time an ending of God and an opening up. And Bernard Esbois, in his portion of the film, where he was discussing some of the more philosophical angle of Kojève's work, he described the end of history in a way that I tend towards a bit more, which this idea of aporia, or we could say contradiction, that no matter, and he said in the film that he felt that Kojève deep down knew that he was operating with a myth of the end of history and the universal homogeneous state. And in fact, this was a concept that was riddled with contradictions. And perhaps these are two different ways of viewing these, or perhaps they can come together in one, the end of God in and of itself as contradiction. And considering your work, your most recent work on Hegel and the centrality of contradiction, I was wondering if you perhaps found any resonance in this idea, or if you had, I mean, this notion of Kojève's central concept, normally one of closing off, one of ending, one of finitude, actually opening up into this space of contradiction. So again, excuse me for the open-ended nature of the question. But. No,
Kyle, it's a great question. That's perfect. Yeah, I think maybe Marco wants to comment afterward, but I think that I really like that yeah, that I think Hegel's notion of the end of history is the idea of a reconciliation with contradiction. And so what you said about Kojève, I never thought about this. I kind of accepted the standard reading of him, but I think that what you're saying, like, I do think, so Hegel's idea is that when we get to some notion of the absolute, or the end of history, the kingdom of heaven is on Main Street, right? This idea that he has. And so that strikes me as a way of squaring the circle of those two different readings, right? Like the end of the God of the beyond, then is the way in which we're reconciled to the contradiction, so, you know, within the society. So I think I think there is a way to think of those together. I mean, I just think that the problem is that when you start from recognition as the starting point, and I think that does, it's hard for me to see Kojève outside of that. I you know that the struggle for recognition is central, but I'd be happy to be proven wrong on this. But I think that once that's the once that's the matrix, when you're thinking about things, then I think mutual recognition ends up being the end point. And then I don't see how contradiction fits in that. But I think the idea that we eliminate the God of the beyond, that the elimination of that is actually co-equal with the grasp of contradiction as the thing that inhabits every social relation. So I do think that because I think that what happens is, I think that the beyond becomes this way of like pushing off the reconciliation. In like we know that there's a future when we'll be free of reconciliation. So as long as you cling to some notion of the beyond, then you can't be reconciled to contradiction. So I think that those two things, that makes sense what you said, that those two things can come together, those two different readings. I just think as long as you're thinking in terms of recognition, you can't get to that point of some kind of reconciliation with the necessity of contradiction.
Anyone want to pick up on that, or should we go to Trevor, who I think was next? Do you want to pick up Alexis directly? Yeah, okay. Do you want to, and then to Trevor.
Sorry, Trevor. Yeah, I want to pick up because I felt I should talk about Bernard Esbois, because believe it or not, we are neighbors. We live in the same street. And so we joyfully discuss and we joyfully disagree on our interpretation of Kojève. And so first of all, I have to say Bernard was quite happy with the movie and quite unhappy with his interventions because he thought afterwards, you know, he how do you say this in English? You know, he realized, well, oh, this is what I should have said. This is what I should have emphasized. And one of his so I think his interpretation of Kojève is that in the end entropy will win. Entropy will win, and but it's by knowingly acting with this thought in mind that you will do something meaningful. This is one interpretation. Maybe it's Kyle's interpretation. Maybe the contradiction within the universal and homogeneous state is a Kantian idea, you know, something that keeps on running. Or maybe someone could take it as a real thing that we can produce. And if you enter this kind of interpretation, then you have to all those sci-fi's concepts that, you know, comes to mind. And I think Kojève was, or maybe is now, an author that is very inspiring for sci-fi writers. I remembered I read a letter from Leon Poliakov who asked him, "Oh, master, what about sci-fi? What do you think about it?" And I wish I could. I wish I know what Kojève answered, but I don't. But Bernard's interpretation is really linked to the impact Kojève had on his life, and Nina remarked it. And Kojève has an impact on people who knew him and on people who read him and who read him. And now our gathering, it shows, I think, that we all find something in Kojève. We all have our Kojève. And maybe it was good to frame ideas in a way that what was understandable for his interlocutor when he was alive. And I think in his writings, he did the same. I don't know how, but he did the same. And that author has an impact that is different somehow. I don't know how, but this is it. And this existential impact is something I think we will discuss between us with time. And Bernard is really, now he's ready to discuss it again. I think for, Kojève won, as he said, he accepted it, and now it's okay to discuss it again, and maybe to write about it, him. So here is just some words about Bernard, because he's not with us and he's an important person for Kojève studies. Sorry, I was a little bit confused, but it's late here and I have my children behind that door, so okay.
No, not at all, Alexis. And yeah, I mean, if Bernard sees entropy, do you see a different or a better type of constructing? Because you were talking about universal basic income yesterday, and I was wondering, also about kind of data, that sort of thing. Like, would Kojève be working for Google today, or would he be still in the European Union and doing those? Can you?
As for me, I think something like blockchain technology because blockchain technology is the machine who produces a consensus regarding a shared past. So it's a public and collective memory. So this technology is the metrical and numerical phenomenon that is paralleled with the notion, the notion which is the discursive, I think we should build the notion of the blockchain technology. For instance, blockchain technology, it might help for the administration, how to organize human actions in a simultaneous way. It's really weird, but I think now there is no government anymore. There is an administration, and blockchain technology is a part of this administration. For instance, this might be one answer to your question.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, and it's not just our applying; it's for Kojève application is crucial. Yes. So, yeah, of course. Thank you. Let's go to Trevor. Trevor's been waiting forever, so it's your moment, Trevor.
Thank you. No rush. I have a question. It's perhaps two questions to Nina Kuznetsov. My first question is about Georg Witt, the filmmaker. So watching this biography or this documentary, I have found it has been interesting to me to see how much Kojève was a photographer. I knew he was a photographer, but I did not realize how central it was to him. So my first question is there anything more to say about his relationship with Georg Witt, who went on to be a filmmaker? Is there some possible cinematic Kojève that one could talk about? Or do you see any relationship between the two of them as filmmakers and photographers, respectively? The second question is also about a photographer, Yevgeny Reis. I believe in French he may go Genia or Genia Rubin, who was also a photographer. But I'm interested, Nina, if you know something or could share something about his relationship with Kojève, because Yevgeny Reis published a biography of Kojève in Russian in 2000, Kojèvnikov Kto vy, which gave an enormous amount of detail about Kojève's early years in Paris when I believe they were living together, which was not in the film. So Nina, I would be interested to hear about either Georg Witt or Yevgeny Reis in any way that you could share.
Now that both people, Georg Witt and Eugène Rubin, as we said in French, are dead, I think, and also Kojève, it's easier to talk about it, maybe. Well, what Kojève told me was that Georg Witt obviously was a very good friend for him, very close. And also he characterized him. He said that he was not at all a philosopher, but curiously, he was a sage, Georg Witt. Now, I don't know much more about him, but this is the impression that I had. So, and he repeated it quite easily. Now, as for, but of course, Georg Witt was in Germany and Kojève in France, so I never witnessed Kojève meeting with Georg Witt. I just saw Georg Witt after Kojève's death because he came to visit Nina Ivanov once. Okay, now about Eugène Rubin. I think, Kojève had very close relations with Eugène Rubin, close and maybe even kind of erotic relations, or same kind of interest for women, etc. So he shared quite a lot also with Eugène Rubin, but it was completely different, and Kojève didn't consider at all Eugène Rubin as someone whom you should hear for what he thought. So it was a completely different sphere. And well, he didn't really consider him as a friend like Georg Witt, but it's true that they shared a very animated and life in Paris, because Rubin came to live in the same apartment as Kojève. It was in fact in Vanves, the apartment of, first it was the apartment of their friend, of Kojève's friend, Jacques Goldberg. And Eugène Rubin had a way of living which was very, how do you say it in English? Like artistic people. He went to live with the one or the other, etc. And so they shared this very animated, and they shared a lot of laughing and enjoying life together. And one event just that I remember is that Kojève, to show how both of them were very merry people. Once Kojève was in his apartment, it was on the ground floor in Vanves at that moment. Later, he moved to the 7th floor, but he was at the ground floor. And one day, suddenly, he sees Eugène Rubin coming along the street, leading a camel. And in fact, Eugène Rubin had taken this camel from someone who had him some way in Paris, and he led him just to show Kojève how he could appear with this animal. So this is the kind of life that they shared together. But also, of course, Kojève appreciated very much Eugène Rubin as a photographer and as a portraitist. Eugène Rubin made many photographs, in particular of Nina Ivanov, also of other members of our family, and also of other friends, female friends of Kojève. So Kojève really admired him as a photographer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I was not expecting that anecdote, I have to say. There's a question in the chat about Kant that Kyle would like to speak about.
Well, yeah, Terry made an interesting comment here about Kojève's later work, post-war work on Kant, and I guess he wants to know if this has any sort of purchase on what we were saying earlier about the contradiction of end of history and the beyond. And I mean, as it was said in the documentary, in the film, that there is by Bernard Hasbo, I believe, he was saying there's a real change in the style that Kojève adopts from his more existential tone in the in his early work in his Hegel lectures, and then in his later work on the system. And yeah, for those who don't know, that the Kant book, I guess it's part of this system and this later system he's trying to develop. And I mean, to sort of answer it while answering Todd, maybe I can say this, that when reading the Kant book, you get less of a centralization of the concept of recognition in this text, for sure. And one of the concepts that comes up all over the place is the idea of discourse. And Kojève is arguing that the Kantian discourse is somehow incomplete, or doesn't allow itself completion because of the existence of, say, God within the system. I'm simplifying, but and it's interesting when you were saying earlier about how if we start, Todd, if we start from recognition, then we end up with a concept at the end of history that can only allow reconciliation, resolution. We can't allow this openness of contradiction. But it's interesting that at the beginning of the introduction, well, in his introductory notes, the essay that's tacked on at the beginning in place of an introduction that he wrote in 1939, Kojève actually sort of directs us towards a different starting point, where he wants to say that the question really is to understand the origin, which is the origin of the I that is revealed first by speech, and connecting this to discourse. And in the film, there's in one of the a few places where we actually get Kojève's voice, he's talking about this idea of discourse and how discourse doesn't allow for explanations of God, and therefore can't be a complete discourse. Theology cannot be a complete discourse, but only philosophy can be a discourse of discourse, or a complete discourse. And if you ask me, there's something of a contradiction in that, a discourse that must explain itself as discourse, as the end. And I mean, I see more of this contradiction coming out in the later work, for instance, on Kant, where discourse is centralized, and then there is this latent contradiction. That's my comment to Terry, but I would also be interested in if Todd has anything to say about that.
No, that sounds really good. I really like that. I think I think it's right that that's exactly Hegel's understanding of philosophy, right? That it's precisely because it explains everything, that it has to run into contradiction necessarily in a way that it's precisely, exactly the point that you just made about Kant is precisely Hegel's critique of Kant, that by leaving that space for faith, he eliminates the necessity of the encounter with contradiction, right? So I think that's really great. And I think the subjection to language seems to me to be the crucial point. It's that initial subjection. So it's great that you draw our attention to that, because it's that initial subjection that makes any recognition impossible, right? Because there's always going to be some lack in the subject that can't be compensated for by any recognition. And so that's why that initial subjectification is really crucial, I think. So yeah, I think that's really great what you're saying.
Terry, do you want to come on and
yeah, sure. Yeah. No, thank you, God. That very, very interesting answer. I also wonder, just to follow up on that, kind of how. So I guess two things. So first of all, the way that Kojève discusses the thing in itself in Kant is extremely interesting. So far as there are points where he kind of aligns it with God, which is, to my mind, is quite it's quite an innovative way of into the critique of pure reason, and it kind of leads to some interesting places for Kojève, I think. I just wonder on how that would play into this kind of end of history thesis. I don't know Kojève as much as you guys do, but I just wonder how that would kind of play into it in terms of thinking through the problem or the contradiction that Kant puts into his philosophy by introducing the thing in itself, which for Kojève, if Kant wanted to be kind of consistent, he would have remained silent. You know, he would have left it out of the system altogether. So I just wonder, like, how that kind of pairs up or chalks up with the end of history, if at all. I mean, if it kind of works with that at all. So maybe kind of you know, people more knowledgeable on Kojève will, like you guys, will kind of know more how that kind of works. And the second one is like, if Kojève, it's more of a kind of problematic, like if Kojève's project is a kind of updating of Hegel, of Hegelianism, like what is it in Kant that, you know, that kind of pushed him to engage so extensively with the critique of pure reason and with the whole critical philosophy? I mean, what is it about Kant that kind of allows him to kind of do that within this kind of umbrella of an update of Hegel?
Yeah, I would just say, I'll just speak to the first question, because I think that's it's a fascinating point that I think it's precisely that Kant holds on to the thing in itself that makes him not have an end of history, right? So like, because there's a thing in itself, there's perpetual moral progress and there's perpetual political progress toward a state of peace, right? And so something that is anathema to Hegel, and so he can think an end of history precisely because he doesn't allow for this category of thing in itself. And so I think to me, that's the crucial thing. And you're right to say that subsequent thinkers picked up that as the contradiction within the Kantian system, but Kant didn't think it was a contradiction at all, right? Like, he thought it was perfectly the thing that guaranteed the coherence of the system, which is maybe the problem, right? Like it's the thing that actually ensures that he's not going to encounter any contradiction within, because he puts it without. And I think it's interesting to think, you know, it's funny because people often, when they're talking about Kant, confuse thing in itself and noumena. But what you're saying is that actually Kojève is like playing off that confusion by saying that if you think of the thing in itself as God, which is a way of confusing that, it actually gets you into a kind of another kind of insight. So I don't know. So that's just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
We had a couple of questions from Marco. One was from Isabel. Can you speak about your new book? And a little bit further up in the chat, question from Ari about kind of mystical Buddhism and so on. So Marco, would you like to take those two questions together?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And about the new book, it's very simple. The editors, not the editor is in Italian. The publishing house asked to me to make a new edition of my book on Kojève, the Sunday philosopher, and I asked to him. So you know, in the first edition, I stopped in 1945, and I had a lot of paper and a lot of subject about Kojève, and above all about this political Kojève. So you know, like Danilo Scholz know very well, and like Massimo Palma, in this last 12 years, we found a lot of paper about the relationship to Kojève with Henri Moisset, who was a minister of the Pétain government, and what Massimo Palma says before, the relationship with Carl Schmitt, and also all the question about the Latin Empire. And so, you know, maybe somebody talked before about the problem, if there is a problem, of Kojève like KGB spy. So I try in this new edition of my book to write. In my idea, I'd like to write 10 or 15 pages. I wrote more than 150 about this part of political thought of Kojève, and about the problem, the question on Kojève and the KGB. I just made a footnote like Kojèvian style. And about the question on theology, Buddhism, and Solovyov from Harry Solon, it's very hard to answer of this question. I think that Kojève was in relationship with theology, and in his thought, it's very difficult. When somebody asks to Kojève why Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty doesn't understand your interpretation of Hegel, his answer was because they aren't theologian. At the same time, he spent a lot of time with Jesuit theologians. So I think that there is a metaphysical part of the Kojève thought that usually we used to say, so Kojève was a Marxist. At the same time, I think that he wasn't a Marxist. He wasn't someone who has a relationship very, very hard, if I say, with the theology and the relationship with Carl Schmitt and with Jakob Taubes and with the Jesuit say us that he never, how to say, to understand him, I think that it's necessary to understand this part of metaphysics point.
Thank you, Marco. We have about 10 minutes left, so if people want to think of last questions or last comments, I'd encourage you to do that. But before then, we've got a hand up from Nina Kuznetsov. Nina, would you like to say
yes,
something?
it will be very short. I just wanted to add, after what Marco said, that recently I heard of a French historian who contacted me, who is called Henri Dupuis, and who is now writing a history of the participation of Russians in the French resistance, Russian immigrants and also Soviet Russians. And he told me that he started to look for archives of different resistant networks, and that he found a lot of factual testimony in these archives in the southwest of France. And this is just to say that, for instance, what is told about Kojève trying to return Tatars soldiers working for Germans was not at all just separated action. It was inside. It was made inside networks, and he was very active, circulating and giving assistance to these networks all over southwest of France during the war. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Question for Todd in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think it does, in the sense that that it's not an opposition for him, right? Like, and I think this is true for. I think he gets this from Hegel as well. That the singular emerges out of the social, and yet it still is singular. So I think that is true. That there's a way in which he's by bringing together the dialectical and the phenomenological, he's trying to think that relationship in a way that no one has thought it before. So yeah, I think that's right.